Why does Brad Holmes refuse to address the pass rush for the Detroit Lions? Going into the offseason, there was rumors, there was speculation that Brad Holmes was going to spend every single penny possible to replace and revamp this defensive line. A defensive line that finished 24th in sacks with only 18 from the edge rushing group. It was a team that couldn't get to the quarterback. They couldn't end drives and they couldn't put sacks on the board. And yet here we are at the end of March with less than a month to go to the NFL draft, and the Detroit Lions not only aren't better at the edge rushing position, but they actively got worse. And today, we're going to take a look at exactly why that is. We're going to take a look at the offseason strategy so far, what the NFL draft looks like, as well as some of the remaining free agents and options that the Lions have, and talk about why it's not too late to potentially still make the Detroit Lions one of the top pass rushes in professional football. So, with that being said, let's take a look at last season, right? Because it wasn't very good, and the Detroit Lions got worse since that year. Now, in 2024, the Detroit Lions ranked 24th in team sacks, with only 18 of those sacks coming from the edge rushing position. 7.5 came in the first 5 games from Aiden Hutchinson. You have, of course, Zadarius Smith, who had 4, but has since been released. You have Al-Qadim Muhammad, who recorded 3, Josh Paschal, who recorded 2, and Marcus Davenport, who recorded just a singular sack through 3 games before he went on IR with a season-ending injury. The defensive line wasn't very good, but Brad Holmes has addressed it a little bit this offseason, more so in the interior, but still the address has been there, right? Looking at the interior defensive line, you have Ali McNeil and DJ Reader, who will be your starters. You have Levi Onwuzurike, Roy Lopez, and Mekhi Wingo, who will be your priority rotational players. And then as depth, you have guys like Pat O'Connor, Miles Adams, and Broderick Martin, right? It's a very deep and actually a pretty talented interior defensive line room, but a lot of people are upset about the edge rushing group, and rightfully so. The edge rusher group, as of right now, looks like Aiden Hutchinson, who was fantastic defensive player of the year type candidate. But after that, it gets a little bit rough, right? Your second leading sack getter after that was Al-Qadim Muhammad, who only had 3 sacks in 9 games. Then you go and turn to Josh Paschal, who had 2 sacks in 14 games. And then you turn to Marcus Davenport, who had just a half a sack in 3 games for the Detroit Lions last year. Then you take a look at some of the other depth. You have Isaac Ukwu and Nate Lynn, who both got injured in the first week of the preseason after having phenomenal debuts for the Detroit Lions, but have never played in an NFL regular season game, as well as Mitchell Agude, who has played in a regular season game, but strictly as a special teamer and really hasn't had any impact on the defensive side of the ball. So you look at this roster and you look at this group and you think, okay, Aiden Hutchinson's awesome. I think Josh Paschal and Al-Qadim Muhammad are okay with Marcus Davenport, but there really isn't a good edge rusher too, right? There isn't a true second tier edge rusher that can get you 8, 9, 10 sacks in the season, right? That can take that pressure away from Aiden Hutchinson, and certainly not a guy that you trust to stay healthy enough to do it consistently in 2025. So going into the offseason, that led a lot of people to really obscure and very high seeking trades and free agents, right? The trade options, options in quotes, because I don't think they truly were, but a lot of people wanted Myles Garrett. Well, Myles Garrett got re-signed and wasn't even a trade option to begin with. A lot of people are upset that the Lions didn't trade for Myles Garrett or Max Crosby or Trey Hendrickson, but the reality is that nobody traded for those players because those players weren't truly available for trade. So we can knock all of that off, right? We can look at that and say, okay, well, that was never a realistic option. That was a pipe dream and something that we wanted to happen, but was never going to happen and did not happen for any NFL team this offseason. So you can't be upset that they didn't do that. And then you look at free agency where you have guys like Josh Sweat, DeMarcus Lawrence, Azeez Ojulari, Dante Fowler, Chase Young, Charles Omenihu, Joseph Osai. And you look at those guys and you say, well, why couldn't any of those players be the Detroit Lions? Well, it's because the Brad Holmes does things a very particular way. There is a particular Lions type of mantra you have to fit in order to be here. And on top of that, value matters. Value matters for Brad Holmes, and it has always mattered for Brad Holmes. If you are asking for way too much money or you are asking for a contract that Brad doesn't believe that you are deserving of and can live up to, he's not going to give out that contract, right? The biggest contracts he's ever given out are to DJ Reed, who is just a newly added addition to this team. He gave a big one out to Cam Sutton before all of that stuff went down, and it looked like a good deal, but obviously turned out not to do so. And outside of that, he really hasn't given out any major contracts to incoming free agents. So if you knew the Detroit Lions, you knew that guys like Josh Sweat, you knew that guys like DeMarcus Lawrence were not on board because they were far too expensive. And in order to keep this core together, they cannot commit to an exterior free agent who has never played here just to potentially have a big name. So guys like Josh Sweat, DeMarcus Lawrence, they are out. I think same thing with Chase Young. He was asking for quite a bit too much money, and I think he went back to the Saints regardless without really truly testing the market. So then you go to cheaper guys like Azeez Ojulari, Dante Fowler, Charles Omenihu, and Joseph Osai. And you say, well, why couldn't those guys be Detroit Lions? Well, because the other mantra of being a Detroit Lion is obviously being tough and gritty, but defending the run and being a 3-down traditional defensive end. Things that neither Dante Fowler, Azeez Ojulari, or really Joseph Osai really embody into their game, right? I think Charles Omenihu would have been a fantastic pickup for the Detroit Lions, and certainly one that the Detroit Lions did miss out on. But considering the fact that he went back to Kansas City, he got a good contract from them, has already played there, knows the coaching staff, it was going to be an uphill battle, and the Detroit Lions would have had to significantly have outbid the Chiefs for Charles Omenihu. So even that one, I will admit, is a little bit of a miss, but at the end of the day, he obviously wanted to return to Kansas City, and when a player wants to be somewhere and is offered a solid contract to do so, it's really hard to sway their opinions in other ways. Well, so let's look at the remaining free agents, right? I think there are a couple of guys out there. I think you take a look at, John Kaminsky, a player that didn't play last year, but is a good defensive end, does get about 3 to 4 sacks a season for the Detroit Lions and would be relatively cheap. You look at Emmanuel Ogbah, a player that, is pretty athletic, had 5 sacks last year in Miami, can defend the run and be a good option for cheap. You look at Calais Campbell, who is 39 years old, but is 6'9", is a big player, still playing at a high level and played well in Miami a year ago. He could still be a great player for the Detroit Lions to sign. I think Jihad Ward fits that mold. I think Carl Lawson fits that mold. And if Zadarius Smith is willing to come back, I think he fits that mold as well. Why the Detroit Lions may not be willing to pay him $12 million next season for what he performed a year ago, if he could return for $5-6 million, half the price of what he was offered for his former contract, I see no reason why they wouldn't bring him back and potentially pair him up with Aiden Hutchinson for the first time. He was a good player. He had 3 sacks for the Detroit Lions a year ago, had 9 sacks on the season overall. You pair him next to Aiden Hutchinson, I think he could still be a pretty decent edge rusher too, but even that is not a long-term option. Brad Holmes has always built through the draft. Every single time, every single year, they build through the draft. They went from a bottom dweller to a, NFC championship appearance through the draft. They went to the NFL's #1 seed largely because of the draft picks that Brad Holmes has made over the last 4 seasons. And that's not going to change. That is their identity. For better or worse, for right or wrong, that is the Detroit Lions' identity. They draft players, they develop players, and those players are going to decide their fate. Now, looking at the Detroit Lions defensive end, right, again in quotes, the Lions defensive end, they look for traditional guys, big, strong run stoppers, power over finesse, 3-down players, and they like players that are a good value. Unless you're a homegrown talent, you're probably not getting big money here. So in order to get that big money and in order to get that superstar, they have to be found in the draft. And there are many players that do fit that mold, right? You have Abdul Carter from Penn State, James Pierce from Tennessee, Mike Green from Marshall, Landon Jackson from Arkansas, JT Tuimoloau from Ohio State, along with Jack Sawyer, Princely Yu from Ole Miss. You have Josiah Stewart from Michigan. You have Savion Jones from LSU. There are lots of players in this draft, both in the early and later rounds, that fit what the Detroit Lions really like in their defensive ends. And I have no doubt that they'll draft at least 1, if not 2. I wouldn't be surprised if they go with a very similar approach to last season, where secondary was the big issue. Cornerback was the big issue. So they draft not only Terrion Arnold, but also draft Ennis Rakestraw. They'd put big capital into the first and second round positions that they need the most, because that's where they need players to develop, and that's where they need depth and quality of talent. This year, it is nearly the same situation. They re-signed a lot of players from the year before. Last year, they did go out and get Carlton Davis. This year, they didn't make a big trade, but the big need is at the edge rusher position. That makes me believe that they are going to take at least one, if not two edge rushers very early in the NFL draft. I'm talking 28 and 60. In their first two selections, I would expect defensive line additions for the Detroit Lions, whether that be a Landon Jackson, a Mike Green, a Josiah Stewart, a Savion Jones. I don't know. But I would very much expect the Detroit Lions to double up at defensive end in the draft. And even right there, the Detroit Lions look significantly better. You pair that with maybe one very cheap late stage free agency signing, and all of a sudden, the Detroit Lions go from a pretty poor free agency class and a pretty poor defensive line to all of a sudden a really good one, right? Let's say, just for example, that the Detroit Lions do sign one of Campbell, Ogba, or Smith from free agency, and say they draft Mike Green and Josiah Stewart. The defensive line looks phenomenal. Aiden Hutchinson is your pass rusher 1. Calais Campbell is your edge rusher 2, with Mike Green getting a lot of rotation and a lot of snaps there as well. You have Josiah Stewart, Josh Paschal, Al-Qadim Muhammad, Marcus Davenport as your really 4 backup rotational edge rushers. And all of a sudden, you look really, really strong. You have 2 top-tier edge rushers, right? A first-round pick from this year, as well as Aiden Hutchinson, who's coming off a great season. You have 4 guys that are fantastic depth in the NFL and an NFL veteran that already has a lot of experience. It doesn't take a lot for the Detroit Lions to take that big step forward. It takes one smaller free agency signing and 2 picks at the top of the draft for the Detroit Lions pass rush to go from below average to potentially one of the better units and one of the deeper units across all of football. It is the only position that truly needs to be addressed this offseason. If the Lions can do that, they will be Super Bowl contenders for years to come. But with all of that being said, that is live for you guys today. Let me know your opinions of the edge rusher situation down in the comments below. Do you believe the Detroit Lions need to be doing more? Do you think they've already missed their window to sign a star and potentially get better? Or do you trust Brad Holmes to go into the draft and find the next superstar? I'm curious what you guys have to say. With all that being said, thank you all so much for watching. If you've yet to subscribe to the channel, please go down below and do so. Leave a comment about the edge rushing situation and who you want to see both in free agency and the draft. Love to hear about it. But with that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.